This is the story of the Feast of San Gennaro, and on September 19, 1926, no one who organized it knew they were founding it. A group of cafe owners on Mulberry Street in Little Italy, Manhattan, had built a small chapel in the middle of the street. Inside it, they've placed a statue of a martyred bishop who died in the year 305. They ask the people passing by to leave a few coins for the saint. The coins go right back out to neighbors who need them. There's a prize for the best decorated fire escape. Then a group of men lift the statue onto their shoulders and carry it through the tenement-lined streets, accordions and mandolins playing, the music bouncing off fire escapes strung with laundry and Italian flags. The men who organized it think they're throwing a one-day party. They are actually founding an institution that will outlive almost everything else in the neighborhood around it. The tenements, the pushcarts, the language, eventually the people themselves. It is called the Feast of San Gennaro, and 100 years later, it will still be filling Mulberry Street every September. But by then, it will be filling only 3 blocks of a neighborhood that once ran 50. That's the story. Not a single disaster, not one bad decision, not a villain. A neighborhood that peaked at 10,000 people packed into 2 square miles and shrank, block by block, decade by decade, until what's left is a nostalgia economy wearing the old neighborhood's clothes. To understand how that happens, you have to start where the 10,000 people actually were. Little Italy did not begin as Little Italy. It began as Mulberry Bend, the section of Mulberry Street where the road crooked like an elbow to avoid a swamp that used to be a pond. 19th century reformer Jacob Riis called it, simply, the foul core of New York's slums. He wasn't being poetic. The Bend was a maze of back alleys with names like Bandit's Roost, Bottle Alley, and Ragpicker's Row, and it had been one of the worst pockets of the old Five Points district for decades before any Italian ever set foot in it. Riis would later write about those alleys in his book How the Other Half Lives, one of the most consequential pieces of documentary journalism in American history, and 4850 Mulberry Street, one of the tenements he named by address in that book, is still standing today. The first Italians arrived in the 1830s and 40s, fleeing a failed revolution back home. That was a trickle. The flood came later, in the 1870s, driven by poverty in southern Italy, and then in a wave so large it reshaped the demographics of an entire American city. Between 1880 and 1914, 13 million people left Italy. 4 million of them came to the United States. 3 million of those arrived in a single 14-year window, 1900 to 1914, most of them from the South and from Sicily. They didn't spread out. They packed into the Bend, into the same tenement buildings Riis had photographed as the worst housing in the city, and they kept packing in, even as reformers tried to tear the worst of it down. In 1897, the city finally demolished Mulberry Bend itself and built a park where it had stood, landscaped by Calvert Vaux, the same man who helped design Central Park. That park still exists today. It's called Columbus Park. A few tenements on the east side of Mulberry Street survived the demolition. One of them, 4850 Mulberry, is the same building Riis mentioned by address in How the Other Half Lives. It's still standing today. Here is what the neighborhood's economy actually looked like once the tenements filled in around that new park. It was not industry in the abstract way that word gets used. It was specific, and it was hard. Italian men dug ditches, paved roads, and built projects that are still standing today: the Brooklyn Bridge, the subway, Grand Central Terminal. Italian women and girls went into the garment trade, which by the 1890s had absorbed wave after wave of immigrant labor, first the Irish, then Germans and Swedes, then, starting in that decade, Italians alongside Russian and Polish Jews. Recent arrivals converted small tenement apartments into contract shops that doubled as their own living quarters. The work was unregulated. Contractors competed fiercely for jobs, and immigrants who desperately needed the work had no leverage to push back. Wages stayed low. Hours stayed long. On March 25th, 1911, that arrangement produced one of the deadliest workplace disasters in American history. A fire broke out at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. 146 workers died. Nearly half of them were young Italian women. That is the economic engine underneath the postcard version of the neighborhood, the pushcarts, the vendors hawking fruit and vegetables from the gutter because the sidewalks were too crowded to hold a cart. One description of Mulberry Street from the period called it a tortuous ravine of tall tenement houses, so full of people that the throngs going and coming spread off the sidewalk nearly to the middle of the street. The crowding wasn't atmosphere. It was the direct result of 10,000 people living where maybe a fraction of that number could comfortably fit. Laborers, garment workers, street peddlers, all stacked into buildings the city itself had once condemned as slums. They built a world on top of it anyway. By 1910, Little Italy's Italian population had reached almost 10,000 people, the peak of the community, packed into a compact area of roughly 2 square miles. At the turn of the century, more than 90% of the residents of the local ward were of Italian birth or origin. This was not, strictly speaking, the largest Italian neighborhood in New York. East Harlem, sometimes called Italian Harlem, would eventually house more than 100,000 Italian Americans at its own peak in the 1930s, 3 times Little Italy's total population. But Little Italy had something East Harlem didn't, a concentration so total and a geography so compact that the whole world could fit inside a walk of a few blocks. And within those few blocks, the neighborhood organized itself with the precision of a village map transplanted whole from Italy. Mulberry Street belonged to the Neapolitans. Mott Street belonged to the Calabrians. Elizabeth Street was so completely Sicilian that each individual block claimed its own hometown, and the street earned its own nickname, Little Sicily. Hester Street held the immigrants from Apulia. Martin Scorsese, who grew up in this world, would later recall that marrying someone from a different block counted, among his neighbors, as a mixed marriage. Mulberry Street on a weekday in this period is crowded to the point that pedestrians spill off the sidewalk into the gutter, and the gutter itself is taken up by vendors' carts selling fruit and vegetables. Fire escapes are strung with laundry. Somewhere close by, a shop is making mozzarella by hand the same day it will be sold. This is not a themed street for visitors. It is a neighborhood at working density, doing what a neighborhood does, housing people, feeding people, employing people, at a scale almost impossible to picture from what remains of it now. Some of what was built in these years is still standing, still open, still run by the same families. In 1892, an opera-loving immigrant named Antonio Ferrara and his business partner, Enrico Scopa, opened a cafe at 195 Grand Street. New York had no place yet where an Italian could relax after a night at the opera, play the card game Scopa, and drink an espresso, so they built one. It became, by its own later claim, America's first espresso bar. The tenor Enrico Caruso was a regular, not just a customer, but the kind of regular whose presence anchored the place in the social fabric of the neighborhood. He liked the coffee, but he loved the cookies. Caruso was, by that point, the most famous Italian in America, and the fact that he spent his free evenings on Grand Street rather than uptown said something real about where the center of Italian New York actually was. Ferrara stayed in the family. After Antonio Ferrara died in 1937, his nephew Pietro Lepore took over. 5 generations of that family have now run the same cafe on the same corner since 1892. In 1910, a cheesemaker named Savino Di Paolo arrived from a mountain village in Basilicata and opened a dairy shop on Mulberry Street. It took him 4 years to earn enough to send for the rest of his family. His daughter Concetta opened her own shop nearby in 1925 at the corner of Grand and Mott and called it C. Di Paolo after herself. Her descendants, great-grandchildren now, still run it today. In 2025, Di Paolo's marked 100 years in the same location. And in 1905, a business opened at 53.5 Spring Street that would become, according to the Pizza Hall of Fame, the first pizzeria in the United States. Lombardi's. The story New Yorkers have been told for decades is simple. An immigrant baker named Gennaro Lombardi opened a small grocery store in 1897, started selling tomato pies wrapped in paper and tied with string to feed local factory workers on their lunch break, and by 1905 had turned it into a full pizzeria. Keep that story in mind. It is not finished with you yet. Success in a poor, dense immigrant neighborhood attracts more than customers. By the early 1900s, an extortion racket known as the Black Hand was targeting Italian businesses across the city, threatening violence unless owners paid up. The NIPD's response was a detective named Joe Petrosino, an immigrant himself, who rose through the ranks to become the department's first Italian detective. Colleagues and the press called him the Italian Sherlock Holmes. He led a special task force, the Italian Squad, built specifically to take down the Black Hand and the wider Mafia network feeding it. The squad worked. By the time of Petrosino's death, it had made 3,557 arrests, with a conviction rate of 36%. In 1909, Petrosino was sent on a secret mission to Palermo, Sicily, to gather intelligence on Italian criminals before they could immigrate to America. He sailed under a false name. American newspapers found out anyway and printed his mission before he'd even reached his destination. On March 12, 1909, while walking through a Palermo piazza to meet a supposed informant, Petrosino was shot and killed. He remains the only active NIPD officer ever killed in the line of duty overseas. His killer was never formally convicted. 250,000 people crowded the streets of New York for his funeral. It was declared a public holiday. That's the neighborhood's other founding story. Not the cafe and the cheese shop, but the detective who died trying to protect the people who ran them. By 1920, the wave that built Little Italy had crested. Nearly 400,000 Italians had settled across New York City. Little Italy itself, at its physical maximum, is remembered as running across 50 square blocks, bounded, depending on who you ask, by Lafayette Street to the west, the Bowery to the east, Kenmare to the north, and Worth Street to the south. By 1920, the boundaries had stretched even further, reaching from Broadway to Bleecker to the Bowery. The exact edges were never fixed. That's a detail worth sitting with. Even at its largest, the neighborhood didn't have a hard border. It had a density, and the density is what people meant when they said, Little Italy. Into this world, dense, self-organized by home region, thick with pushcarts and tenements, and the smell of fresh mozzarella, the Feast of San Gennaro was born in 1926. What started as a group of cafe owners roasting chickens in the street and passing a hat became, within a few decades, an 11-day festival stretching across 11 blocks of Mulberry Street, drawing hundreds of vendors. San Gennaro himself, the patron saint of Naples, was said to have been thrown into a furnace during the Roman persecutions and emerged unscathed before finally being beheaded around the year 305. In Naples, vials said to contain his dried blood are still said to liquefy on certain days each year, and according to old superstition, when the blood fails to liquefy, disaster follows. The blood reportedly stayed solid before Italy entered the Second World War, and again before a deadly earthquake in 1980. This is the peak. 10,000 people, a neighborhood organized street by street around Italian regions, a festival that could fill 11 blocks, a cafe that had already been open 30 years, a pizzeria just getting started, a detective's memory still fresh enough that 250,000 people had walked behind his coffin. None of it was going to stay this size. The forces that unwound Little Italy did not arrive all at once, and they did not arrive from a single direction. At least 5 distinct forces worked on the neighborhood, on 5 different timelines, and the first of them started working before most of the neighborhood's most famous restaurants had even opened their doors. In 1929, the city planner Robert Moses first proposed a 10-lane elevated highway that would connect the Holland Tunnel to the Manhattan and Williamsburg bridges, cutting straight across what is now Soho and Little Italy. It came to be known as the Lower Manhattan Expressway, or LOMEX. The plan, revived and reproposed for decades, would eventually call for razing 14 blocks and displacing just under 2,000 families and more than 800 businesses, at an estimated cost of $72 million. Jane Jacobs, the urbanist and neighborhood activist, led the opposition. The fight dragged on for decades, through multiple proposals and multiple decades of political maneuvering, until the city finally killed the plan. Here is the part of the story most people never hear, and it's the part that matters most for understanding why the neighborhood shrank the way it did. Little Italy property owners never believed Moses could actually be stopped. They watched him build one project after another across the city and assumed this one too was inevitable. So many of them sold their buildings in anticipation of a demolition that was still years away, a demolition that, in the end, never happened. The highway was defeated. The neighborhood emptied out anyway. Say that plainly, because it's the kind of detail that reverses everything you assumed about how a place like this unravels. There was no bulldozer. There was no wrecking ball rolling down Mulberry Street. The threat alone was enough to do the highway's work for it, years before the highway was ever formally canceled. And long after the fight was won, the buildings that had already changed hands stayed changed. The second force arrived from a completely different direction, and it had nothing to do with highways at all. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 removed the restrictive quotas that had throttled Chinese immigration to the United States for decades. A new wave of Chinese immigrants began settling in the neighborhood just south of Little Italy, the historic Chinatown, Manhattan, which at the time occupied a modest 7-block footprint around Mott and Mulberry Streets. As that population grew, so did the footprint. Chinatown expanded to an estimated 55 blocks, stretching from the East River to City Hall and from St. James Place north past Canal Street. In the process, it swallowed the traditional dividing line that had once separated it from Little Italy. Buildings that had been part of the Italian enclave were converted into garment factories and offices. Rents in Chinatown climbed to some of the highest in the city. By 1980, the Chinese community in New York, including the outer borough neighborhoods that had grown alongside Chinatown, had become the largest in the country, surpassing San Francisco's. It would be easy, looking only at a map from before and a map from after, to tell this as a story of one community displacing another. That reading gets the timeline wrong. Chinese immigrants had settled in this same stretch of Lower Manhattan around the same time as Italian immigrants, sometimes earlier. What changed after 1965 wasn't who arrived first. It was the rate at which the two communities grew from that point forward, and the fact that Little Italy's Italian population was already contracting on its own, for entirely separate reasons, starting in the 1950s, as families who had achieved a measure of prosperity did what so many American families were doing at the time. They moved to the suburbs, two forces, working on two different clocks, converging on the same blocks of Lower Manhattan. The third force didn't require a policy or a population shift at all. It required a name. By the 1990s, the stretch of Little Italy north of Canal Street had a real estate problem. It wasn't the fashionable retail corridor that its neighbor Soho had become, and property values reflected that. Real estate developers tried, unsuccessfully, to market the area as an extension of Soho. When that didn't stick, they invented something new. The New York Times documented the debate over what to call it in a May 1996 article, weighing several proposed names before settling on the one that eventually took, Nolita, short for North of Little Italy. The name followed a pattern set by Soho itself, south of Houston Street, and by Tribeca, the triangle below Canal Street. By 1998, the rebrand was already visibly reshaping rental prices in the area. Boutiques, cafes, and bars moved in. The northern blocks that had once been simply the top edge of Little Italy became something the market could sell separately and at a premium. The remaining blocks to the south weren't spared the same pressure, just delivered by a blunter mechanism: direct rent increases on the businesses that had been there the longest. A single real estate group bought 5 buildings on Mulberry Street in the 2000s. Among the tenants forced out were Paolucci's, a restaurant that had been open since 1947, and E. Rossi and Company, an Italian gift shop that had operated on the corner of Mulberry and Grand since 1936. A longtime resident summed up what had changed in plain terms. Landlords had realized these old businesses were popular and weren't paying much rent, and once Little Italy became a tourist attraction, landlords used that popularity to justify raising the rent. Il Palazzo, another restaurant, had been open since the 1980s before it, too, was evicted, after falling behind on a monthly rent of $17,000 and being told the new rate would be nearly double that. 3 forces, on 3 different schedules: the highway that scared owners into selling before it was ever built, the demographic shift that followed a 1965 immigration law, and a real estate rebrand that turned the neighborhood's own popularity into the mechanism of its own displacement. By the 2000 census, only 1,211 residents in the 3 census tracts making up Little Italy claimed Italian ancestry, about 8.25% of the local population, almost exactly the same proportion of Italian ancestry found across the entire city. Little Italy was, by that measure, no longer meaningfully more Italian than anywhere else in New York. By 2010, the census found something more specific still. Not a single resident of Little Italy had been born in Italy. One more strand runs parallel to all the others in this story, because for decades, the version of Little Italy that reached the rest of the country wasn't the garment workers or the cafe owners. It was the mob. In 1972, a restaurant called Umberto's Clam House opened at 129 Mulberry Street, founded by Umberto Ianiello. It was also, according to a federal judge, secretly owned by his son, a reputed Mafia figure known as Matty the Horse. 2 months after it opened, on April 7, 1972, a Colombo crime family racketeer named Joseph Crazy Joe Gallo stopped in after a night out celebrating his 43rd birthday. Gunmen entered the restaurant and opened fire. Gallo was hit 5 times. He staggered out to the street and died there. He had reportedly believed he was safe at Umberto's, that there was an unwritten understanding among gangsters that Little Italy itself was off-limits to bloodshed. The original location closed in 1996. The restaurant reopened at a new address 2 blocks away in 2000, and it's still there. A few blocks over, at 247 Mulberry Street, a social club had operated under various names since 1919. In the 1950s, the Gambino crime family boss Carlo Gambino took it over and renamed it the Ravenite. For decades, it hosted a rotating cast of the city's most notorious organized crime figures: Lucky Luciano, Albert Anastasia, Aniello Della Croce, before becoming, in the 1980s, John Gotti's personal headquarters after he rose to lead the Gambino family. FBI surveillance of the club eventually helped bring Gotti down, and the Ravenite closed for good in 1993. Federal marshals seized the building and auctioned it off. 247 Mulberry Street today holds a boutique, a men's clothing store in recent years, after a run as a shoe shop before that. The renovation kept one thing from the building's previous life: the original tiled floor. The cracks in the tile have simply been patched over with cement rather than replaced. Customers browsing clothing racks are standing, without knowing it, on the same floor where Gotti once met with his underboss. And the pizzeria that started this whole story, Lombardi's, the one credited as America's first, turns out to have its own complication buried in it. Research published in 2019 dug into Gennaro Lombardi's actual immigration records, his birth certificate, his naturalization papers. They show he first arrived in America in November of 1904 at age 17 and was classified on arrival as a laborer. If he was involved with the pizzeria at 53½ Spring Street when it opened in 1905, the timeline suggests he was working there as an employee, not as the owner whose name the business still carries. The researchers point instead to a man named Filippo Malone, or possibly a proprietor named Giovanni Santillo, as the pizzeria's actual founder. Neither name appears on the sign, and the pizzeria's current owner, the man now telling visitors that Lombardi's is the birthplace of American pizza, was named a captain in the Genovese crime family by law enforcement in 2017. None of this makes the pizza less real. It just means the plaque outside doesn't tell the whole story, which, by this point in the neighborhood's history, is starting to feel like the rule rather than the exception. By the time all of these forces had finished their work, what remained of Little Italy had become something closer to a museum than a neighborhood, a fact that turned out to be almost literally true. Adele Sarno moved into a two-bedroom, second-floor walk-up off Mulberry and Grand Street in 1962. In 1942, as a young woman, she had been crowned Queen of the Feast of San Gennaro. Her father had installed the apartment's hot water heater, its bathroom, its baseboard heat, improvements the original building never had. She paid her rent every month for 53 years and never late. When she moved in, the rent was $150 a month. In 2008, her landlord became the Italian-American Museum, an institution founded by Joseph Scelsa to preserve exactly the kind of Italian-American history Sarno had lived through firsthand. By the time the museum wanted to expand into her building, Sarno's rent had climbed to $820 a month. The museum sought to raise it to something closer to what her upstairs neighbor was paying, $4,500. A civil court judge ultimately ruled that her apartment wasn't covered by rent stabilization protections, clearing the way for eviction proceedings. $150 a month, then $820, then a demand for $4,500. Sarno fought the eviction for 5 years. "I was born in the next building," she said, "and I was a princess of the feast until I became the queen. I am Little Italy, not him." One of her advocates put the irony as plainly as it can be put. You're fighting a museum that exists to exhibit Italian-American culture, and it's proceeding to evict a living artifact of that same culture. In 2015, Sarno reached an agreement with the museum. She had until the end of June to leave the apartment she'd lived in for 53 years. She is not the only voice from this last part of the story. Lou DiPaolo, whose family has run their cheese shop since 1925, put it a different way, not as a fight, but as an inheritance. His grandparents' generation became American, he said. They melted into mainstream America, and now his job, his children's job, his grandchildren's job, is to preserve the Italian culture as part of the American way of life. Geraldine Danza, who has spent her life making fresh ricotta and mozzarella at Oliva, the oldest cheese shop in the neighborhood, described what that preservation actually feels like from the inside. Little Italy is very transient nowadays. People are coming and going. Nobody really raises families here anymore. What's left, physically, is 5 blocks of Mulberry Street, north of Canal Street, down from a peak that once ran 50. What's left, demographically, is a neighborhood where the largest concentration of Italian ancestry in New York State is no longer in Manhattan at all, but in Tuckahoe, a town in Westchester County. What's left, institutionally, is a handful of businesses that have genuinely run continuously across the whole span of this story. Ferrara's since 1892 and DiPaolo's since 1925, standing alongside a museum, a historic district designation, and a festival that keeps growing even as the neighborhood around it keeps shrinking. In 2010, the federal government listed Chinatown and Little Italy together on the National Register of Historic Places, a single historic district, more than 40 blocks wide, stretching from Lafayette Street to the Bowery, from East Houston Street to Worth Street. It is, on paper, a form of protection. It does not require anyone to live there. This September, the Feast of San Gennaro turns 100 years old. It began as a handful of cafe owners roasting chickens on Mulberry Street and passing a hat. It now fills 3 blocks, not 11, not 50, and draws crowds the original organizers could never have imagined. walking a stretch of the old neighborhood that has been almost entirely repurposed for the walking. The grills will still smoke. The saint's statue will still be carried down Mulberry Street one more time. The people who built the neighborhood the festival was invented to celebrate are, by the government's own count, no longer there to see it.